Nintendo has just confirmed that Super Mario Bros. Wonder is getting its own Nintendo Direct on the 31st of August, which will be about 15 minutes in length. And it remains to be seen if we're going to get like another Direct later in the month, or like if we're going to get like some new Direct by the end of the year. But like there's some speculation that this might be the only Direct that we see this year, and there is some logic behind that. If like it feels like we know about everything else other than Super Mario Bros. Wonder. Like the only game I felt like we really needed a Direct for was Super Mario Bros. Wonder, and seeing it get its own independent Direct, yeah, that makes sense. This might be our big September Direct that we were waiting for. So at the very least, my prediction that we would be getting a Nintendo Direct was correct. But like this is a Super Mario Bros. Direct. I'm not gonna get upset about this, because I know that we're gonna get another Nintendo Direct like sometime next year, early next year, by I don't know, March at the latest. Like I'm not too concerned about this, right? Like there are plenty of games coming out that I'm looking forward to, and I'm very much anticipating the release of Super Mario Bros. Wonder. However, like it's really interesting to me, like going into this release, like thinking about it, like following along with like the discussion online. And I've mentioned this several times already, but this really needs to be bared. This really needs to be repeated because I think it really is true that like the online community, gamers, 4chan, YouTube, NeoGaf, I'm sure. Like NeoGaf's not relevant anymore, but whatever. Twitter, like everyone seems to be adamant. Everyone seems to be seems to legitimately believe this game is not going to be a big deal. It's not going to be all that successful. It's not going to be all that popular. That like this is just some like side game, right? That this isn't a big deal, and that like the real success story would come from a new 3D Mario game, right? That is the narrative that a lot of people are putting out there, is that this is not a big release at all, and then it's just some minor thing as Nintendo like holds off the release of like the Switch 2. Like I've seen people speculate that like maybe they should put this game on the Switch 2 instead, or like why are they putting this out now? But like I haven't seen like anyone like outright say this is going to be like the last major Switch game, but if anything, like the narrative right now seems to be that like this game will not be a big deal. Period. Even Sean Malmstrom, the man who made an entire blog, what was it, like 15 years ago? Longer than that, I think. An entire blog dedicated to talking about how 3D Mario was inferior to 2D Mario, right? That guy, the guy who constantly sings about the praises of like the original New Super Mario Bros. And how it like drove like Nintendo sales through the roof and how it was like such a big deal. Like even that guy is trying to say that Super Mario Bros. Wonder is not going to be all that successful. A take that I heartily disagree with, right? Super Mario Bros. Wonder looks amazing, right? It looks like it's a really cool return to form and evolution of the Super Mario Bros. Formula. It looks like it has everything we love about these games. And we are in an era where I think 2D games are not stigmatized the way they used to be. Like, I think 10 years ago, or like especially 20 years ago, like at the advent of 3D gaming, like everyone thought of these games as being cheap, as being like derivative, as being like kind of samey, and like that mindset is still continuing online. But there can be no denying that there is a lot of enthusiasm for this stuff, right? Like I feel like with every passing year, people have more and more of an appreciation for 2D games. Like I feel like if Metroid Dread came out in like 2006, like it would have gotten some flack for being like a 2D game or looking the way it does or whatever. But like it came out in 2021 and it did fairly well, right? Like it's the best-selling Metroid game of all time, in spite of like Sean Malmstrom. I just saw Sean Malmstrom try to claim that like Metroid Prime has sold more because of like the remastered version, which I don't know. There's an argument to be had about that, like about like where you should include like remastered versions and sales, right? Like if you included all the remastered, all the ports of like Super Mario Bros, it would be like higher than higher in sales than like Grand Theft Auto 5, I'm sure, right? But those numbers aren't publicly available, so we have to like just stick with the original release, right? Like, and again, I think this goes to show you just how unreliable, like, talking about sales for a game is when it comes to hyping them. Like people don't realize how big Super Mario Bros. Actually is, right? People don't realize how big the average Nintendo IP actually is. People keep calling like Pikmin a niche IP. That's a million seller. That's been consistently a million seller since it came out. Like it's not as unpopular as people make it out to be. Like people call Metroid niche. Again, a million seller. People call Fire Emblem niche. Million seller. And like the numbers keep trailing upward consistently. And the numbers for like Mario, Pokemon, for Zelda, like they are becoming more and more ridiculous with each release. Right. I remember when people would try to say like Zelda was niche, that it was like declining in popularity in like the mid 2000s, and look where we're at now, where like Tears of the Kingdom outsells like Elden Ring in like less than 2 months, right? It's crazy, right? Nobody wants to admit it's true. Like nobody wants to admit that like No Man's Sky is not as successful as people make it out to be. Like people like to say that like No Man's Sky had like some glorious return to form, but like it sold 10 million units. Like plenty of Nintendo games came out with on like a stricter budget, came out much quicker, like have sold more than that, right? Mario Party has sold more than that. I think some Splatoon games have sold more than that. Like there is a lot to be said about the current state of the industry where people don't want to admit how well Nintendo is doing. We're even seeing this with the Mario movie at this point. Like, how often do you see people say it's in like number 15 highest grossing film of all time and like the third highest grossing like animated film of all time? Like, you don't see people talk about it. Instead, see people try to say it wasn't a very good movie, or that it was like a cash grab, it was like a commercial, that like other movies have done better than it, when they're kind of like invalidating like the success of a film like this, right? That like a film as simplistic and straightforward as the Mario movie could be so successful on like a first outing really shows how strong Nintendo's branding actually is, right? I can tell you from experience, I did not grow up on like Nintendo games that I bought myself. It was all stuff that like my family bought for me or gave to me secondhand and stuff like that. And then I played Donkey Kong Country, Yoshi's Island, A Link to the Past, Super Metroid, stuff like that. And then I kind of like started getting my own games, like you know F-Zero X, Pokemon Snap, Donkey Kong 64, Mario Party 2, right? Those were like the earliest Super Nintendo N64 games that I got for myself, right? And then it expanded from there, right? Like I became a fan of Nintendo through games that I did not purchase myself. Like sales numbers are not an indication of how popular a game is, right? Like I think Super Mario Bros. Is a way bigger brand than people give it credit for. Like right now, the narrative is that the series isn't as popular as 3D Mario, that it can't possibly do well, that it's not that big of a deal. But it's possible that like Super Mario Bros. Wonder might be a Game of the Year contender, assuming that like there's some crazy thing we haven't seen yet, right? Like I went into like Pikmin 4 expecting it to be a Game of the Year contender and was like very, very, very underwhelmed by it. To the point where like I'm not even sure like where I'm gonna put it like on the top 10 list, if I even put it on a top 10 list at all. Like Pikmin 4 was disappointing, even though I expected it to be great. So it's possible that like with the Mario Wonder Direct, we might actually see something that proves Mario Wonder can compete in like the grand scheme of things, like with the very best games that have come out this year, right? And by extension, this is going to lead to like it becoming extremely popular and extremely successful, right? And it's going to be like successful no matter what. Don't get me wrong, but like I think people are very, 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 very strongly downplaying the popularity of the brand, how much it's going to sell, and how good the game actually is. Right? It's crazy. Like Kirby and the Forgotten Land is a really good example of this. Right? Best-selling Kirby game ever made. Over 6 million units sold. One of the best Kirby games ever played. Period. Like officially my favorite Kirby game of all time. Right? An incredibly stellar game. You don't see people talking about it. Like, not because the game isn't spectacular and people don't love it, right? Much like with Tears of the Kingdom, like, people buy and play this game. They enjoy it. They declare it to be, like, the best at what it is, right? But then they move on to the next thing, right? Like, we don't dwell on entertainment because we don't revolve our lives around video games, right? Like, I'm not just going to sit here and say that, like, oh man, Kirby and the Forgotten Land is the greatest game of all time. Like, no, I told you that when I played the game for the first time, right? When I played it on stream, when I did videos on it, and then like when I finished it, I moved on to the next thing, right? And I don't regret doing that. Just like I don't regret doing it for Tears of the Kingdom, and just like I won't regret doing it for Pikmin 4 or Super Mario Bros. Wonder. But that all it does not mean that these games are bad, right? Quite the opposite. Like it means they're spectacular. Like I will come back to talking about Kirby and the Forgotten Land and Tears of the Kingdom when I come back to them, when I have something to say about them. Until then, I'm just going to keep enjoying my life and playing other games. People don't understand that Super Mario Bros. Wonder is going to be way bigger than any of them can possibly imagine. People don't understand how big Super Mario Bros. Wonder is, or how big like Nintendo is in general. Like they just want to keep plugging their ears and keep living in denial that like Nintendo has won the console war. And all that like the establishment can do right now is like try and pretend they're not nearly as successful as they actually are, right? Doing everything they can to like prop up inferior brands like Sonic, like Crash Bandicoot, like a Spider-Man, PS4, Baldur's Gate 3. Like they're doing everything they possibly can to like pretend as if Nintendo cannot compete. When in reality, it's like the exact opposite. Like there is not a single game this year that can compete with Super Mario Bros. Wonder in like the 2D platforming space. And that in and of itself is a monumental achievement to Nintendo and its team.